The 1947 fire that turned Maine to ash and redefined the landscape of New England forever. It was the autumn that changed everything, the fire that no one expected and everyone would remember. The 1947 fire that turned Maine to ash and redefined the landscape of New England forever. Chapter 1. The silence before the storm. October in Maine had always carried a certain stillness, the kind of quiet that settled over fishing villages and forest roads like a blanket, wrapping the landscape in the cool embrace of approaching winter. In 1947, that stillness felt different. It felt heavy. It felt wrong. For 108 days, not a single drop of meaningful rain had touched the soil of Maine. The summer had been wet, almost unusually so, and the forests had responded with abundant growth. Ferns carpeted the forest floor. New saplings pushed toward the light. Wildflowers bloomed in meadows that seemed to stretch forever. But by mid-July, the weather had reversed itself completely. The rain stopped. The sun blazed down day after day, and all that lush, vibrant growth began to wither and dry. By October, the forests of Maine were not forests at all. They were kindling, waiting for a spark. In the town of Bar Harbor, on Mount Desert Island, life continued with its familiar rhythms. This was a place where wealth and wilderness had coexisted for generations. Along the shores of Frenchman Bay, magnificent summer estates lined what locals called Millionaire's Row. The Rockefellers had walked these paths. The Morgans had sailed these waters. The Vanderbilts and Astors and Pulitzers had built their summer retreats here, mansions with names like Stanwood and Sonnegy, where servants outnumbered family members and the problems of the ordinary world seemed very far away. But in October, most of those wealthy families had already returned to Boston and New York and Philadelphia. Their cottages stood empty, shuttered against the coming cold. The caretakers remained, of course, tending to grounds that would need to survive the winter. The year-round residents of Bar Harbor went about their business, unaware that their world was about to change forever. Eleanor Marshall was one of those residents. She had lived in Bar Harbor her entire life, all 53 years of it. Her husband worked at one of the boatyards, and her 2 grown sons had taken jobs on fishing boats that operated out of the harbor. On the morning of October 17th, Eleanor woke before dawn, as she always did, and went to her kitchen window to check the weather. The sky was clear, too clear, the kind of pale, washed-out blue that came from too many days without clouds. She could smell smoke in the air, faint but unmistakable. Somewhere, something was burning. But in those days, in those conditions, something was always burning. Small fires had been cropping up across the state for weeks. Most were contained quickly. Most were forgotten just as fast. Eleanor made her coffee and thought nothing more of it. 20 miles away, in the town of Waterboro, Franklin Spofford was already at work. He and his wife Juanita lived on Granite Point Road, in a modest house that Franklin had built with his own hands 15 years earlier. They had no children, but they had each other and they had their home, and in 1947 that felt like enough. Franklin had noticed the smoke too. He had noticed how the leaves were falling early this year, dried and brittle before their time. He had noticed how the ground cracked beneath his boots when he walked through the woods. He was not an anxious man by nature, but something in the air that morning made him uneasy. In Kennebunk, at the Brickstore Museum, Edith Barry was working on a new painting. She had founded the museum herself back in the 30s, and she spent most of her days there surrounded by the artifacts and artworks that told the story of her beloved Maine. Her current canvas showed a peaceful autumn scene, the kind of New England landscape that tourists came from all over the country to see. She would never finish that painting. Within a week, she would be working on something very different, a painting that would capture a night sky filled with flames, trucks piled high with furniture, families fleeing for their lives, a painting that would hang in that museum for generations, a testament to what was coming. But on the morning of October 17th, Edith Barry did not know any of this. None of them did. They went about their days, ordinary people living ordinary lives, with no idea that the world they knew was about to end. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, a woman named Mrs. Gilbert picked up her telephone. She lived on the outskirts of Bar Harbor, near a cranberry bog that bordered Acadia National Park. From her window, she could see smoke rising from the direction of Dolliver's Dump, a local garbage disposal site on Crooked Road. It did not look like much, just a thin column of grey against the pale October sky. But Mrs. Gilbert was a careful woman, and in a dry season like this one, any smoke was worth reporting. She called the Bar Harbor Fire Department and told them what she had seen. At 4:05, the alarm went out. A single pumper truck with 4 firefighters responded. They arrived at 4:18 to find a small fire, perhaps an acre in size, burning on the edge of fresh meadow. The source was unclear. Perhaps someone had been careless with a cigarette in the cranberry bog. Perhaps a trash fire at the dump had escaped its boundaries. No one would ever know for certain. Fire Chief David Sleeper directed his men to begin a direct attack. Additional volunteers arrived, 16 more men in total. At 4:45, Chief Sleeper called Acadia National Park and requested additional resources. The park responded with a fire truck, a dump truck, 2 portable pumps and 5 rangers. By nightfall, the fire seemed to be under control. The men worked through the darkness, spraying water on the smoldering edges, digging trenches to contain the spread. The winds were light, only 8 to 10 miles per hour from the southwest. There was no reason to believe this fire would be any different from the dozens of others that had been extinguished across Maine that autumn. But beneath the surface, in the thick layer of dried peat and decomposing vegetation that carpeted the forest floor, the fire continued to burn. It crept through the underground, feeding on roots and organic matter that had accumulated over decades. It moved slowly, invisibly, spreading in directions that no one could see. The fire was not out. It was waiting. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because stories like this one, stories of courage and survival, and the moments that define who we are, deserve to be remembered, and this channel is where those stories live. Subscribe now so you never miss the moments that matter. Chapter 2. The Smoldering Days. For 3 days, the fire near Dolliver's dump burned quietly. Firefighters maintained their watch, extinguishing the occasional flare-up, confident that the situation was under control. On October 18th, the burned area expanded slightly, but nothing alarming. On the 19th, more of the same. By the 20th, Chief Sleeper allowed himself to feel cautiously optimistic. He should not have. Across Maine, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Reports of fires were pouring into the Forest Service from every corner of the state. Small blazes in Portland, brush fires in Bowdoin, flames spreading through the dry woods of Wells. These fires were separated by 30 miles or more, which illustrated the scope of the danger. The entire state was a tinderbox, and sparks were landing everywhere. In Waterboro, residents watched nervously as smoke rose from multiple directions. The Waterboro Fire Company had already been called out once, on October 17th, to help fight a fire between Ross Corner and Newfield. The men had worked all night, managing to contain their section of the line. But the fire on the Shapley side continued to burn out of control. By Sunday, October 19th, the fire had spread into Waterboro itself. Over 1,200 acres had burned. Ossipee Mountain was engulfed in flames, lighting up the night sky like a second sunset. Those who witnessed it would never forget the sight. The silhouette of the mountains against the wall of fire, the flames shooting up from burning pines. Some said it looked like a dragon breathing fire. Others said it looked like the end of the world. In these small towns, scattered across southern and eastern Maine, families began to make difficult decisions. Some packed their most precious belongings into trucks and headed for safer ground. Others stayed, determined to protect their homes, filling buckets and tubs with water, wetting down their roofs and lawns in preparation for the worst. Thomas Mitchell was one of those who stayed. He lived with his wife Margaret and their 3 children in a farmhouse outside Shapley, in a house that had belonged to his grandfather. The land had been in his family for 4 generations. He was not about to abandon it now. On the night of October 20th, Thomas sat on his front porch and watched the glow on the horizon. His children were asleep inside. Margaret was packing emergency bags, just in case. Thomas had a garden hose connected to their well, and he had spent the afternoon soaking everything within reach. The grass, the bushes, the wooden siding of the house. He did not sleep that night. He sat on that porch until dawn, watching the sky, listening for the sound of approaching flames. The sound never came. Not that night. But the fire was getting closer. It was always getting closer. Back on Mount Desert Island, the fire near Dolliver's dump had burned through 169 acres in its first 3 days. This was concerning but not catastrophic. The firefighters continued their work, maintaining their lines, believing they had the situation contained. Then came October 21st. The morning started like the others, clear and dry and still. But by midday, the winds had begun to change. They came from the southwest, as they had for days, but now they were stronger. 10 miles per hour became 15. 15 became 20. By early afternoon, gusts were reaching 30 miles per hour, and the fire that had been smoldering quietly for 4 days suddenly exploded into something entirely different. Embers that had been glowing beneath the surface burst into open flame. The dried underbrush ignited instantly, and the fire began to move. It raced through the forest with a speed that shocked even the most experienced firefighters. In a matter of hours, the blaze expanded from 169 acres to over 2,000. The eastern side of Mount Desert Island was burning. Acadia National Park, one of the most beautiful and beloved natural preserves in America, was being consumed by flames. The fire roared through stands of ancient spruce and fir, trees that had stood for a century or more, reducing them to ash in minutes. Animals fled before the advancing wall of fire. Birds took to the sky in clouds of panicked flight. Deer bounded through the smoke, desperate to escape, and still the winds continued to blow. Chief Sleeper called for reinforcements. He contacted every fire department within reach. He requested assistance from the state, from the federal government, from anyone who could send men and equipment. The response was overwhelming. Personnel from the Army, the Navy, the Coast Guard arrived within hours. National Park Service employees flew in from parks throughout the eastern United States. Students from the University of Maine forestry program rushed to help. Even seminarians from Bangor Theological Seminary joined the firefighting crews, trading their books for shovels and hoses. But it was not enough. Nothing could have been enough. The fire had taken on a life of its own. It created its own weather, generating winds and updrafts that carried burning embers miles ahead of the main blaze. These embers landed in dry brush and started new fires, which merged with the original fire to create an inferno of almost unimaginable proportions. By the end of October 21st, over 2,000 acres had burned on Mount Desert Island alone, and the worst was still to come. Chapter 3. The Day the World Caught Fire. October 23rd, 1947. The day that would be remembered forever. The day that changed everything. The morning dawned red. Not the soft pink of a normal sunrise, but a deep, angry crimson that seemed to stain the entire sky. The air was thick with smoke, so heavy that it hurt to breathe. In Bar Harbor, residents woke to find ash falling from the sky like grey snow, coating their cars, their porches, their children's hair. Eleanor Marshall stood at her kitchen window again, as she had 6 days earlier. But this time, she did not make coffee. This time, she stood frozen, staring at a sky that looked like nothing she had ever seen. The smoke was so thick that she could barely see the houses across the street. The sun, when it rose, was a dull orange disk, filtered through layers of ash and haze. Her husband had already left for work, or tried to. He returned within an hour, telling her that the roads were becoming impassable. Fallen trees, abandoned vehicles, firefighters everywhere struggling to hold lines that kept moving closer to town. The winds that day were catastrophic. A cold front was approaching from the northwest, and as it collided with the warm air over the fires, it created conditions that no one had anticipated. By early afternoon, the winds had reached hurricane force. Gusts of 60 miles per hour tore through the forest, ripping burning branches from trees and hurling them through the air like flaming projectiles. The fire that had been advancing steadily toward Bar Harbor suddenly became something else entirely. It became a firestorm. A firestorm is not simply a large fire. It is a phenomenon unto itself, a self-sustaining system of destruction that generates its own winds, its own weather, its own terrible logic. The heat at the center of a firestorm can reach temperatures hot enough to melt metal. The winds it creates can exceed 100 miles per hour, and once a firestorm begins, there is nothing that can stop it, except the exhaustion of its fuel. At approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the firestorm struck. It came down from the hills like an army, a wall of flame 3 miles wide and hundreds of feet high. The roar was deafening, a sound that survivors would describe as a freight train, a tornado, a living thing screaming its hunger. The heat was so intense that trees did not burn so much as explode, their moisture flash boiling into steam that shattered trunks and sent splinters flying like shrapnel. The fire traveled 6 miles in less than 3 hours. Nothing in its path survived. Charlotte Stewart was working that day at the telephone exchange in downtown Bar Harbor. She was a telephone operator, one of the women who connected calls and routed messages across the island. When the fire reached the edge of town, Charlotte refused to leave her post. People needed to make calls. People needed to reach their families, to warn them, to say goodbye if it came to that. She stayed at her switchboard as the fire approached, connecting call after call while the building shook from the force of the winds. Through the windows, she could see the flames advancing, could see buildings catching fire, could see people running through the streets with their children in their arms. Years later, in an interview with historian Joyce Butler, Charlotte would describe what she saw. The fire seemed to erupt from the ground itself. One moment a building would be standing, the next moment flames would burst from its foundation, from its walls, from its roof, all at once, as if the earth itself had decided to burn. The fire department was overwhelmed. They had no equipment designed to fight a blaze of this magnitude. They had no training for conditions like these. They did what they could, which was not nearly enough. Hoses ran dry. Pumps failed. Men who had been fighting fires for decades stood helpless as everything they had tried to save was consumed. Along Millionaire's Row, the great summer estates began to fall. Stanwood, the cottage that had once belonged to James G. Blaine, was among the first to burn. Sonergy followed, then Robin Hood, then dozens more. These were not ordinary houses. They were mansions with libraries and ballrooms and servants' quarters. They had survived hurricanes and blizzards and 2 world wars. They did not survive this. 67 of those magnificent estates burned that afternoon. Along with them went 170 permanent homes and 5 of the largest hotels in town. The fire consumed everything in its path. Rich and poor alike, summer cottages and year-round residences, grand architecture and humble dwellings. If this story is touching your heart, leave a comment now saying, "The strength of those who stayed behind is the true fire that never goes out." This is not just a comment. It is a way of honoring everyone who has ever faced the unthinkable and refused to surrender. By 5 o'clock, the situation had become desperate. The fire had reached the outskirts of downtown Bar Harbor, and the roads leading out of town were blocked by flames. Over 2,000 residents had gathered at the town athletic field, believing they would be evacuated to safety. But when the fire advanced to the edge of the field itself, they were forced to move again, this time to the town dock. There, hundreds of people waited at the water's edge, watching the flames advance, wondering if they were about to witness their own destruction. Local fishermen had prepared their boats for a mass evacuation by sea, but the winds were too strong and the waters too rough. The boats rocked violently at their moorings, and the captains knew that trying to load panicked civilians in those conditions would be suicidal. For a terrible hour, the people of Bar Harbor believed they were trapped. The sea was impassable. The roads were blocked. The fire was closing in from every direction. Some knelt and prayed. Others held their children close and whispered words of comfort they did not believe. Still others stared at the approaching flames with a strange calm, the acceptance of people who have looked mortality in the face and found that fear itself has limits. And then something unexpected happened. The wind shifted. Chapter 4. The Exodus. The cold front that had created the firestorm also saved Bar Harbor from complete destruction. As it passed over the island, the winds rotated from northwest to north, then northeast. The fire, which had been bearing down on the downtown area and the docks, was pushed in a different direction. The wall of flame that had been minutes from consuming the town center was diverted toward areas that had already burned. The downtown did not burn. The docks did not burn. The people who had gathered at the water's edge, believing they were about to perish, were spared. But the danger was far from over. With roads still blocked by flames and fallen trees, evacuation remained critical. A bulldozer operator named Harold Thompson volunteered to clear a path through the debris on Route 3, the main road connecting Mount Desert Island to the mainland. It was dangerous work. The fire was still burning on both sides of the road, and the smoke was so thick that Harold could barely see the blade of his own machine. He worked for hours, pushing aside burning logs and smoldering vehicles, creating a narrow corridor through the devastation. Behind him, a convoy of cars began to form. 700 vehicles carrying over 2,000 people lined up in the darkness, their headlights barely visible through the smoke, waiting for their chance to escape. The evacuation began shortly after nightfall. One by one, the cars moved forward, driving slowly through the narrow, cleared path, flames still visible on either side. Children pressed their faces to car windows, staring at scenes that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Parents gripped steering wheels with white knuckles, praying that the road ahead would remain clear. The convoy took hours to complete its journey. Some vehicles broke down and had to be abandoned. Some families ran out of gas and were forced to walk. But somehow, by some measure of grace or luck or simple human determination, the evacuation succeeded. Over 2,000 people made it off the island that night. Meanwhile, in the waters around Bar Harbor, the fishermen who had been unable to evacuate by sea found other ways to help. They loaded their boats with food, water, and medical supplies and ferried them to communities that had been cut off by the fire. They rescued people who had become stranded on isolated beaches and rocky outcrops. They did what Maine fishermen had always done in times of crisis. They helped their neighbors. Maurice Gilly was one of those who stayed behind to help others. He had lived in Bar Harbor his entire life, and he knew every street, every building, every shortcut through town. When the evacuation began, Maurice did not join the convoy. Instead, he went back into the smoke and flames, searching for anyone who might have been left behind. His wife was somewhere in the chaos. He had not seen her since morning, but Maurice did not search for her. He knew she was strong, and he knew she would want him to help others first. So that is what he did. He found an elderly couple trapped in their home when the fire blocked their door. He led a family with young children through a maze of burning streets to the safety of the docks. He carried a woman who could not walk on his own back for half a mile. Later, when a reporter from the Boston Globe found him and asked about the destruction, Maurice gave an answer that would be quoted in newspapers across the country. "Everything is on fire," he said. "Our big hotels, people's houses, the big estates, everything is going up in smoke. Damage? There is nothing but damage. There is millions of dollars of damage." Then the reporter asked if he had seen his wife. Maurice shook his head. "I have not seen her since morning," he said. "When will I see her? I do not know. I'm going back to try and help the people get out if I can." That was the spirit of Maine in October 1947. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things, neighbors helping neighbors, strangers becoming family. The fire took almost everything from them, but it could not take that. In Waterboro, 20 miles away, the situation was equally desperate. The fire that had been building for days finally reached the town center on October 23rd. There was no warning, no time to prepare. One moment, the sky was filled with smoke. The next moment, the smoke was filled with flames. The Grange Hall, which had been serving as an emergency shelter and Red Cross station, was evacuated when fire began advancing from both sides. The volunteers who had been feeding firefighters and refugees grabbed what supplies they could carry and fled. Behind them, the building that had been a center of community life for generations was consumed. An exodus formed on the roads leading out of Waterboro. One car behind the next, each filled to the brim with belongings and people, all headed out the lower end of town. Fire was all around them, coming closer and closer to the homes, with no fire equipment in sight and no one there to fight it. Franklin and Juanita Spofford refused to leave. Their home on Granite Point Road was directly in the path of the fire, but Franklin had made his decision. He would stay and fight. When the flames approached, Franklin wet down their house with a garden hose until the water pressure failed. Then he and Juanita filled buckets and tubs with water from their well and placed them around the house. As burning debris carried by the wind fell in the grass, setting it afire, they grabbed wet brooms and beat out the flames. Bushes beside the garage caught fire, and they extinguished them. Embers landed on the roof, and they climbed up to put them out. The house across the street burned. Other houses on Granite Point Road burned. The fire roared past them on both sides, so close that the heat blistered the paint on their walls, but the Spofford house did not burn. Through determination, through courage, through simple refusal to accept defeat, Franklin and Juanita saved their home. They were among the lucky ones. Across southern and eastern Maine, the fires of October 1947 were leaving a trail of devastation unlike anything the state had ever experienced. 9 communities were essentially leveled: Shapley, Waterboro, Alfred, Lyman, Newfield, Kennebunkport, North Kennebunkport. The fires swept through the forests and moved with the wind toward the ocean, consuming everything in their path. In all, over 200,000 acres burned statewide. More than 850 permanent homes were destroyed. Nearly 400 seasonal cottages were reduced to ash. 2,500 people were left homeless, and 16 people lost their lives. They were farmers and fishermen, mothers and fathers, people whose only crime was being in the wrong place when the fire came. Some were trapped in their homes. Some were overcome by smoke while trying to flee. Some were caught on roads that became impassable too quickly to escape. One of them was a young girl named Sarah Cormier. She was evacuated from Bar Harbor with her family on the night of October 23rd, riding in the back of an army truck as it made its way through the fire-scarred landscape. The convoy had nearly reached safety when the truck overturned on a curve. Sarah did not survive the accident. She was 14 years old. Her sister Jane would carry that memory for the rest of her life. Decades later, she would speak about it to historians, her voice steady, but her eyes filled with tears. They had escaped the fire, she said. They had survived everything. And then, in a single moment of bad luck, everything was taken away. The fire claimed lives directly and indirectly. It took homes and businesses, forests and farmland, memories and dreams. But it also revealed something about the people of Maine that could not be taken: their resilience, their compassion, their absolute refusal to let tragedy have the final word. Chapter 5. The Long Night and the Morning After. The fires continued to burn through the night of October 23rd and into the days that followed. On Mount Desert Island, the blaze smoldered beneath the surface even after the visible flames had passed. Underground peat fires, the same kind that had allowed the fire to spread undetected in its early days, continued to burn for weeks. Hot spots flared up without warning. Smoke rose from ground that appeared to be cold. The fire on Mount Desert Island was not declared under control until October 27th. Even then, firefighters maintained constant vigilance, watching for any sign of rekindling. Rain and snow fell in the final days of October, providing desperately needed moisture. But even that was not enough to extinguish the deep-burning peat fires. The fire was not pronounced completely extinguished until November 14th, nearly a month after Mrs. Gilbert first called about smoke rising from a cranberry bog. In the immediate aftermath, the scale of the destruction was almost impossible to comprehend. On Mount Desert Island alone, over 17,000 acres had burned. More than 10,000 of those acres were within Acadia National Park, one of the crown jewels of the American park system. Half of the eastern side of the island had been transformed from lush forest to blackened wasteland. The iconic mansions of Millionaire's Row were gone. The grand hotels that had welcomed generations of summer visitors were gone. The forests that had given the island its character and beauty were gone. In their place was ash and rubble and the skeletal remains of trees that had once reached toward the sky. Those who returned to Bar Harbor in the days after the evacuation could barely recognize their town. Streets they had walked all their lives were now unnavigable, blocked by debris and the shells of burned buildings. Landmarks they had used to orient themselves had simply ceased to exist. The geography of their lives had been erased. Eleanor Marshall returned to her home on October 26. It was still standing. The fire had come within a few hundred yards of her property before the wind shift redirected it. She walked through her front door and sat down in her kitchen and wept. Her house was intact, but so many others had lost everything. She did not know whether to feel grateful or guilty, so she felt both. Her husband found work almost immediately, helping to clear debris and rebuild the waterfront. Her sons, whose fishing boats had survived the fire, joined the effort to ferry supplies and provide assistance to communities still in crisis. The Marshall family, like so many others, channeled their shock and grief into action. Across Maine, relief efforts mobilized with remarkable speed. The Red Cross established shelters in every affected area, providing food, clothing, and temporary housing to thousands of displaced families. Churches opened their doors around the clock, serving as feeding stations for firefighters and refugees alike. Community organizations coordinated donations of supplies from across the country. Governor Horace Hildreth had declared a state of emergency on the evening of October 23rd, and President Harry Truman quickly followed with a federal disaster declaration. This made federal resources available to the state, including assistance from the Army and Navy, that proved critical in the firefighting and recovery efforts. But the most remarkable assistance came from ordinary citizens, from neighboring towns, from distant cities, from states that had never experienced anything like the fires of 1947. Help poured in. Firefighters traveled hundreds of miles to join the battle against the flames. Families opened their homes to strangers who had lost everything. Businesses donated supplies without expectation of payment or recognition. In Kennebunk, Steve Spofford's family joined the cleanup efforts. Steve himself would not be born for another 20 years, but the stories of that autumn would shape his entire life. He grew up hearing about the neighbors who had saved each other, the churches that had never closed, the community that had refused to break. The painting that Edith Barry created in the aftermath of the fires became one of the most powerful visual records of that terrible week. It shows a night sky filled with flames, trucks piled high with belongings, families fleeing into an uncertain future. It hangs in the Brick Store Museum to this day, a reminder of what was lost and what was saved. The recovery would take years. The emotional healing would take longer still. Some families never returned to the communities where they had lost everything. Some businesses never reopened. Some wounds never fully closed. But Maine rebuilt, slowly Painfully, with setbacks and struggles, the state put itself back together. New homes rose from the ashes of the old. New businesses opened where others had burned. New forests began to grow in places that had been reduced to bare earth. The forests that grew back were different from those that had burned. The ancient stands of spruce and fir that had dominated Mount Desert Island before the fire were replaced by deciduous trees. Birch and aspen and other sun-loving species, whose seeds had blown in on the wind or sprouted from old stumps, took root in the newly opened landscape. The island that emerged from the fire was not the same island that had existed before. It was something new, something transformed by tragedy into a different kind of beauty. Today, visitors to Acadia National Park can still see the evidence of the 1947 fire. The change in vegetation types is visible on the sides of the mountains, where the dark green of the surviving conifers gives way to the lighter colors of the deciduous forest that grew up in the fire's wake. The forests are recovering still, with shade-loving spruce and fir slowly reclaiming territory from the sun-loving species that colonized the burned areas. But the process will take centuries to complete, if it ever does. Chapter 6. The Legacy of Ash and Renewal. The fires of 1947 changed Maine forever. Not just the landscape, though that transformation was dramatic and lasting. They changed the way the state thought about fire, about disaster preparedness, about the relationship between communities and the forces of nature. In the immediate aftermath, investigations were launched to understand what had gone wrong. How had a small fire in a cranberry bog become a statewide catastrophe? Why had the response been so inadequate? What could be done to prevent such a disaster from happening again? The answers were sobering. The state's fire response system in 1947 was fragmented and poorly coordinated. Local fire departments had no way to communicate with each other or with state authorities. There was no system for sharing resources between communities. When multiple fires broke out simultaneously across the state, there was no mechanism for prioritizing responses or coordinating efforts. The fires also exposed the limitations of the firefighting technology of the era. The equipment available in 1947 was simply not designed to combat blazes of this magnitude. Hoses did not reach far enough. Pumps did not produce enough pressure. There were no aircraft capable of dropping water or retardant from the sky. When the fires exploded beyond control, the firefighters on the ground were outmatched. In response, Maine undertook a comprehensive overhaul of its fire response system. A two-way public safety radio network was established, allowing fire departments across the state to communicate directly with each other for the first time. The State Forest Commissioner was given expanded authority to respond to fire emergencies. A public education program about fire safety was launched, teaching citizens how to reduce fire risks and what to do in case of emergency. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the 1947 fires was the establishment of the Northeastern Forest Fire Protection Compact. This interstate agreement, the first of its kind in the nation, created a framework for cooperation between Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New York in responding to forest fire emergencies. Under the compact, states could share resources, coordinate responses, and provide mutual aid in ways that had been impossible before. The compact became a model for similar agreements across the country. Today, cooperative firefighting arrangements exist between states, between federal agencies, and even between nations. The lessons learned in Maine in October 1947 have saved countless lives and prevented countless disasters in the decades since. For the communities that were devastated by the fires, the recovery was long and difficult. Some towns rebuilt essentially from scratch. Others never fully recovered. The social fabric that had been torn apart by the disaster was rewoven slowly, thread by thread, as families returned and new residents arrived and life gradually resumed its rhythms. Bar Harbor was transformed by the fire in ways both tragic and unexpected. The destruction of Millionaires' Row ended an era of aristocratic summer society that had defined the town for generations. The wealthy families who had built those magnificent estates did not rebuild. Many never returned at all. The Bar Harbor that emerged from the ashes was a different place, more middle class, more accessible, more oriented toward tourism than toward serving the needs of the ultra-wealthy. This transformation, painful as it was, ultimately made Bar Harbor more democratic. The town that had once been an exclusive playground for the elite became a destination for ordinary families. Motels and restaurants and gift shops replaced the grand hotels and private clubs. Acadia National Park, which had always been open to the public, became the main attraction rather than a scenic backdrop for summer society. Today, Bar Harbor is one of the most popular tourist destinations in New England. Millions of visitors come each year to explore Acadia National Park, to eat lobster by the water, to experience the natural beauty of the Maine coast. Few of them know the history of Millionaire's Row. Fewer still can imagine what the town looked like before the fire transformed it. But the memory persists. In the Bar Harbor Historical Society, housed in one of the few summer mansions that survived the fire, artifacts and photographs tell the story of what was lost. In the Brickstore Museum in Kennebunk, Edith Barry's painting still hangs, a window into a night of fire and fear. In towns across southern and eastern Maine, memorial signs mark the places where the fire burned, reminding passing motorists of the disaster that reshaped their communities. And in the forests of Mount Desert Island, the land itself remembers. The birch and aspen that replaced the ancient spruce and fir are growing old now, and in their shade, young conifers are beginning to rise. Someday, perhaps centuries from now, the forest may return to something like what it was before the fire, or perhaps it will become something entirely new, a landscape shaped by both destruction and renewal. That is the nature of fire. It destroys, but it also creates. It ends one chapter and begins another. The forest that grows after a fire is different from the forest that burned, but it is not lesser. It is simply changed, transformed by an experience that cannot be undone. The people of Maine understand this. They have lived with fire for as long as they have lived on this land. They know that nature is not always gentle, that the same forces that create beauty can also bring destruction. They know that resilience is not about avoiding hardship, but about finding the strength to continue after hardship comes. In October 1947, that strength was tested as it had never been tested before, and the people of Maine did not fail. They fought the fires with everything they had. They saved their neighbors when they could. They mourned their losses when they could not. And when the fires were finally extinguished, they picked up the pieces and began again. That is the true legacy of the 1947 fires, not the destruction, though the destruction was devastating, not the transformation of the landscape, though that transformation was profound. The true legacy is the reminder that even in the darkest moments, even when everything seems lost, the human capacity for courage and compassion and renewal remains. The fire remembered, the people endured, and Maine, scarred but unbroken, continues. If you watched until this moment, it is because this story touched something inside you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far." This way I can get to know you and know who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. Also, if this story moved you, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear about the courage of ordinary people in extraordinary times. These stories deserve to be told, and your support makes that possible. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, now is the perfect time. Every week, we bring you stories like this one. Stories of resilience, stories of humanity, stories that remind us who we are and what we are capable of becoming. Subscribe now. Join this community of people who believe that history is not just about dates and facts, but about the human beings who lived through the moments that shaped our world. Thank you for watching, thank you for remembering, and thank you for being part of this journey through the stories that matter. The fire of 1947 turned Maine to ash, but from that ash, something new and enduring grew. And the story of how that happened, the story of the people who refused to let tragedy have the final word, that story will never be forgotten. Until next time.